Please be seated. Whoops. Wrong place, wrong time for a Pharisee today. What's a religious leader doing with a idolatrous symbol in his pocket? More specifically, what is he doing with it in the temple? Notice that Jesus cannot produce one of those in the temple. He has to ask for it. There was a system in place, you know. Remember money changers? This allowed you to rid yourself of these idolatrous symbols as you entered the temple so that you can pay the temple tax. But their religious leader trying to entrap Jesus happens to have one in his pocket. Jesus asks them two questions. Whose image is on the coin and what title? They only answer the first question. That would be Tiberius's image, the emperor's image. You know why they don't answer the second question? Is because they know they are entrapped. Because the title is God. The emperor is divine. Tiberius is the Lord. And they wouldn't dare say that inside the temple. So as entertaining as it is to watch one of Jesus' takedowns, we would miss the point if we did not ask ourselves how this incident applies to us. What does it mean to render unto God what is God's? Just a side note here. It's very important to understand that what's happening in a very radical way is Jesus sees the future as not being temple-centric. In fact, we all remember that wonderful moment when he says the temple will be destroyed in 3 days and I will raise it back up. Went right over the heads of the disciples. What does this even mean? Jesus was talking about his body. He was relocating the temple to the body. Paul picks this up as well when he says our bodies are the temple of God. Now, think about the availability of God now. You know, sometimes people say, well, I went out to nature to meet God this weekend. That's why I wasn't in church. But wherever your body is the temple. We don't have a patent on God's presence. God's temple is found in you. This is radical. It really is disempowering to the structures of religion. And I mention this because this story brings us directly to the question of what images of the divine we allow to creep into our temple. What idolatrous icons of a God lurk within the pockets of our minds that do not serve us? How much attention do we pay to our image or sense of God and whether it's accurate, whether it's really something that reflects the depth of the tradition Jesus was building upon? I think we strive to create images of God because we find it difficult to trust. But hear this. It's impossible to trust an idea. It's just an idea. You don't give yourself to an idea. But if our sense of God remains as an idea or a pretty good concept, it never comes down to our heart. Remember, even Moses would not recognize God in a lineup. never saw God's face. It would just be too much. But this fact that God is beyond comprehension, that God is beyond images that we put on God, does not mean that God is distant. We have to be perfectly clear about that. The scriptures speak of God knitting us together in our mother's womb. They speak of knowing us before we existed, numbering the hairs on our heads. Like Moses, God knows our name. So the scriptures speak of all this intimacy. If anyone knows who we are and what we are called to do, it's God. If anyone knows what we truly need, where our deepest hurts and longings reside, it's God. The God who both holds us, but is beyond being held in any image. So Jesus asks a good question, a healing question. A question that will guide you and calm your spirit. What is God's? What should we render unto God? If we spend some time mindfully pondering this question, we will be reminded that we did not create ourselves, did not pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, and we are ultimately not in control. But we believe in reliance on God. And there's great relief and healing when we offer back to God what is God's. Isn't that what prayer is? Prayer is not kind of waking God up to something God missed. By the way, did you see the news? It's lifting up. We pray for all these people in our prayer list. And I was reading somebody's thoughts the other day who said that by lifting up one prayer, you've changed the world. You may not even know that person, but you've extended love and compassion out into the world by lifting up, by offering, by letting go. Isn't that what we're doing, is rendering to God what is God's? We don't own our loved ones. Render to God what is God's. We don't own this world. We lift up to God what is God's. We do this, we teach this prayer in the confirmation class of the six movements, because sometimes teenagers don't like to say anything when we're mentioning the word prayer. But, the six motions are a clenched fist, which starts with maybe something we can't see about ourselves, maybe some knot in our stomach, maybe something that's so hard to look at that we don't even know why we're feeling the way we're feeling. And the action is to open that up. And then to allow God to take it. The second action. Third action. Fourth action is the empty hands, which allows you now, with that burden released, to look for something good that God wants to place in your heart, and then to put it there. And the sixth movement is gratitude. But the letting go, the knowing what is God's, is very, very important. And not creating an image of God that would deny that or not be present to that. One of the things that we can render unto God is our suffering. We often hold our suffering very, very tight. It's almost like we're ashamed of it or something. We don't share it. It's always been, I guess, a mystery to me on some level that people vanish when they're suffering. You don't see them for a while. because they just don't want to be known as someone that suffers. Or they feel they're going to bring somebody down. But the reality is this is God's. The things that we suffer with. We need to rid ourselves of the image of a God who we resist because we're waiting for God to fix everything before we're present. That's not the way it works. If God could fix everything, then make everybody happy, make everybody get along, we would at best be happy puppets. Why is there such suffering in the world? Where is God? What does faith mean right now, given our world situation? I was listening to a podcast this week of Jungian therapists, always entertaining. And they were discussing what they're seeing right now in their clients. And one of them described this time as a trauma vortex. A trauma vortex. If you don't believe that, and you don't adjust yourself to what's happening in the world right now, between wars, between the degradation of our planet, our home, people having ideas of how do you terraform another planet? Why don't we terraform our planet? The division that we feel across the planet and in this country. The pain that we see at the border. The pandemic. Oh, nothing happened to us then. It has no impact on me. Not at all. It's a trauma vortex. And they are all making it hard to live forward in any hopeful way. But the first step is acknowledging it. So I want to kind of close this offering with a statement that God is not just interested in what we believe, but also in what we feel. What we ultimately long for is, yes, to know God, to know of God's love and acceptance, but underneath it to feel God's love and acceptance in the most intimate of ways. And to know that God is with us right now at this moment, not in some future moment that's a little better. But it's in this, God is in the suffering moment. And this requires that suffering is not seen as a challenge to belief, but rather an invitation into the very heart of God. You know how, someone comes to you and they open their heart and they say, I'm really having a tough time. What if part of the suffering that we carry in us is God sharing God's feeling with us? What if it's an honor and privilege to suffer because God is feeling the same thing? What if it's that intimate? That my suffering is connected with God's suffering. The planet's suffering is connected with God's suffering. That this is not an argument against God. It's an invitation into the very heart of what God feels for us. God is with us in that very sensitive and intimate place. This is primarily why Scott Denman has to be a Christian. I'm not saying I'm better or that I don't believe in other religions, but I'll tell you my testimony is that I am a Christian because of what Jesus did and what Jesus modeled. There is no religious leader like Jesus. None. What was premiered in the life of Jesus was his death and resurrection. It's central to our faith. And it's so crucial to remember that. Jesus, when he took up the cross, he invited us to take up our own cross and follow him. But he had a cross. He carried a cross. It was difficult. He said, you can do it too. Follow me to where I'm taking you through the suffering. Don't avoid it, but offer your suffering with me. You won't go alone. I am with you. If we are not connected to our suffering and that of the world, we end up with a theology, not a relationship. I don't want a theology. I want a relationship with God. God who is right there sitting with us on our bed late at night when we cannot sleep, having nothing but questions and doubts, feeling that God has abandoned us. Jesus himself felt that. Jesus' response to suffering isn't, well, try this. Jesus' response to suffering is that, I know. I've felt that. I've been there. I am so glad that Jesus, from the cross, did not utter Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Yea, though I walk through the valley of death, I shall fear no evil, for thou art with me. He backed it up one to Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? You know why I'm glad about that? Because now I can have a serious conversation with God. Now I can talk to a youth who just went through a terrible breakup and his heart is broken and say, God's been there. God is there. I can talk to a parent who's had a terrible loss. And I can know that this is not about self-help. It's about the presence of God right there in the suffering. You're feeling it, God is feeling it. That's the ground on which we move forward. As much as I like Zarathustra and Zoroastrianism, because they moved us towards monotheism, Zarathustra died from a heart attack. Okay. Muhammad, I guess, from what they say, died from an extended kind of poisoning that happened to him over a period of time. Socrates, hemlock. Buddha, apparently, according to one scholar, died from tainted pork.
Oh, it'll get you every time.
The point is simple. Jesus was the only religious leader who endured suffering purposely and intentionally to be incarnational to us. It's not about ideas or wisdom or theology or anything. It's relational. Here I am. Take a look at my wounds. I am here for you. I am incarnate, not just in the world over there. I am incarnate in your temple, your body, your soul, where you're hurting, everything about your life. Simone Weil said that false gods turn suffering into violence. Can't stand the suffering. Can't bear the suffering. It turns to violence. She said, the true God turns violence into suffering. How do we stay with the suffering? We stay there because God is there. God is present, resonating, vibrating, feeling all the suffering in the world. May this time of suffering be an invitation to devotion to the suffering God, who knows us all and loves us all. May we start there. carrying each other's burdens and looking for the hope that turns violence into suffering, and the suffering which turns into compassion. Render unto God what is God's. May we start by rendering unto God our suffering.